This is Mike, and welcome to episode number 170 of the EcomCrew podcast. For today's episode, I'm going to jump right into it because this is one of the most important episodes of the EcomCrew podcast we've ever recorded. It's about the Online Merchants Guild, and it's something that I talked about a few podcasts ago, a couple months ago, but things have really kind of hit a critical spot for this now. And if you're an e-commerce seller, regardless if you want to support Online Merchants Guild or not, I highly recommend listening to this episode, really understanding the dynamics of where sales tax lies today in the e-commerce landscape and why the Online Merchants Guild is so important. So with that, I just want to remind you, if you want to go to the show notes and leave a comment about this episode, you can go to ecomcrew.com/170. And besides that, let's jump right into this talk with Bernie and Paul on the other side of the intro.
Welcome to the EcomCrew podcast, hosted by Mike Jackness and Dave Bryant, who together run e-commerce businesses that generate 8 figures annually. Mike and Dave take pride in running a podcast that isn't just fluff, talking about specific products, problems, and real-world solutions. In the words of one of our favorite reviews, this podcast is like a playbook for e-commerce. You can take any episode and spend the next month trying to implement it. So without further ado, here's the EcomCrew.
Paul and Bernie, welcome back to the EcomCrew podcast, guys.
Hey, how's it going, Mike?
Pretty good. Can't complain. Well, I guess I can. That's what we're going to be here talking about. But otherwise, things are good. But yeah, let's. We had you guys on the podcast a couple of months ago, and we'll put that in the show notes of the episode. But it was episode number 136, and we were discussing a new trade organization that we had put together called Online Merchants Guild, and we've been getting some decent traction, some support to this point, but we have a pretty big, ambitious thing we want to tackle here. We're going to be talking about today. And if you're listening to this podcast and sell anything online, like if you listen to one podcast all year, I think this is the one you probably want to listen to because the implications of what's going on are pretty dramatic. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So without sounding secretive or whatever, let's talk about exactly what we're talking about, which is the sales tax ruling that came down, the Wayfair case. Obviously, probably a lot of people that listen to this podcast have heard about that. But Paul, if you could just interject real quick and kind of summarize what that case was about and what happened there, and then we'll kind of continue from there.
Sure. Well, Mike, thanks for having us on. Again, this is a huge issue right now, and one that are sort of a monumental task for a young trade association to have to take on right out the gate. But that's kind of what inspired us to do it, right? That's what kind of we all got together and decided this is what we want to do.
Yep. Because
this is needed in the community. So Wayfair, there's a case that, I sort of separate it from the Amazon world in that, if you really look at the legal of it, you're talking about a situation where a multi-billion-dollar company is avoiding sales tax collection by claiming it's too much of a burden and relying on how many years old, but the Quill case goes back to 1992, and then there was the 1959 Bellis Hess case before that, this whole physical presence concept. And so, Wayfair and other companies are basically saying, without physical presence, we're constitutionally protected from having to collect sales tax. That's the way it should be. And the Supreme Court's just looking at this and shaking their heads and saying, I can't believe that you're actually with a straight face telling us this. You're Wayfair. And, so in some ways that's a good thing, because I do think big companies that are multi-billion-dollar companies should probably collect sales tax on things that they sell. I think it's fair and it's good for states that need the money. But where this is really bad is that the state governments, really, in my opinion, weren't really going after Wayfair. They were really kind of just trying to get a mandate to go after, the Amazon sellers. And that to me was a little disingenuous because obviously they're not going to bring an Amazon seller before the Supreme Court. And so with this decision, this removal of physical presence, the states are basically going to operate under a mandate that, all Amazon sellers are tax dodgers and they all need to get into compliance and file state tax returns in every state, whether it's sales tax or income tax, and you're all going to have to spend $100,000 or more in compliance costs, pay God knows how much in back taxes to states like California. I mean, it's an absolute nightmare.
Yeah. So let's kind of break down these things piece by piece. I mean, I think that
Sure.
it's important for people who aren't, up on the legal side of things. So let's talk about the way things kind of were before, which is that you would have to have a physical presence in a state to create what's called Nexus. So like you'd have to have you're the lawyer, so I'll let you explain it better than me. But what would, not getting into like what's the new kind of but what would physical presence mean, like kind of by the old definition?
Yeah, sure. So typically, like you have an employee, you have a warehouse, which sounds like FBA, but it's not really. But you're using, you're storing inventory there. You're making regular sales calls there. There's actually two types of Nexus, which is Nexus under the Due Process Clause and Nexus under the Commerce Clause. I will say that most of the Nexus we talk about, especially physical presence, really relates to the Commerce Clause. And rarely, certainly the tax service providers don't address the Nexus under the Due Process Clause, which is a big deal for Amazon sellers because we don't direct our activities towards the state. Like I don't say, hey, I want this to go to the California Amazon Fulfillment Center and only the Amazon Fulfillment Center in California, and I only want this inventory to be shipped to California customers. Like we don't do those things where we're specifically targeting or what we call purposely availing ourselves of those states. So there's a big question, even with Wayfair as to whether there's Nexus under the Due Process Clause for Amazon sellers. It's sort of like if I ship a bunch of stuff via FedEx and it ends up in Tennessee, do I have Nexus in Tennessee because that's where the FedEx depot happens to be? It's kind of ridiculous.
And over and above that, I mean, Amazon controls the customer and we really don't, but we'll get into that a little bit more as this call goes on. So the bottom line is the way that all of us have kind of been operating was that, let's say like we're in California, we have physical presence here, like no question about it. Like I live in California, I have a warehouse in California, I have employees in California, but that's the only state that I had any of those check the box things done. And so for what we had been advised and the way that we kind of always been operating is that we have Nexus in California and don't in a state, let's say like neighboring Nevada, because we don't have any employees or products there. But now the Wayfair case basically has opened up the door for a new type of Nexus test, which is this economic Nexus. Instead of having a physical presence, just having an economic presence in that state by interacting with enough people or shipping enough products and goods into a particular state. This is all in massive flux right now because there was only, I guess, a few states that had these laws in the books previously, and now a bunch of states are kind of rushing to do this. So let's talk about how that from a legal perspective. Let's not get into the opinion part of it, but like, what is economic nexus and what states does that trigger that in right now?
Sure. So it's actually still an unknown. I mean, the court sort of intimated that the economic nexus rule of South Dakota seemed reasonable, and they actually said it's particularly because Wayfair is a big company. They actually made that point, and they left open the door that this could be challenged by a small business for other reasons, which is, I don't want to get into all the legal mumbo jumbo, but there's a lot of other legal reasons we can challenge this.
So what is that reasonable, quote, I'm using air quotes here through the podcast. Yeah. What's the reasonable limits there in South Dakota?
Right. So right now, the South Dakota rule for economic nexus is 200 transactions or $100,000 in sales, which I'm sure Bernie can attest to. And Bernie, you may want to tackle this. What do the numbers really say about the $100,000 threshold? Most tax professionals and I've spoken to are pretty much ignoring the $100,000 number and just sticking with 200 transactions because there really is no proportional relationship between the two.
Yeah, the average e-commerce transaction on Amazon is under $25. So what's weird about that Supreme Court threshold is you hit the 200 transactions at about $5,000 in revenue for a typical e-commerce transaction on Amazon. And then, we'll talk a little bit more about non-Amazon type scenarios, but if you're doing, basically digital goods, you could hit that 200 transaction threshold even way before that very easily. So yeah, that's one of the odd things about that Supreme Court ruling, and the states are really aligning with it. I'm looking at a table here where we have, in October. So this is basically, a month and a half from now. There's at least 5 or 6 states whose economic nexus threshold has been either created or readjusted after Wayfair to this $100,000, 200 transactions threshold, and they're expecting compliance as of October 1st of this year, 2018.
And that's why we got to get to work. But I will mention, too, and there is an unknown question here, too, which is, listen, prior to Wayfair, states thought you had Nexus if you were an FBA seller, right? So in other words, had Wayfair won, states still would be going after FBA sellers unless there was some really sweeping language coming from the courts. So I'm not sure economic nexus even applies to Amazon sellers, because I believe I've seen states make comments like, your FBA presence is basically your nexus, so you don't have to worry about 200 transactions. You're here with 10 transactions.
Right. So you immediately, like by that definition, if a state so chooses to say that, because there's two sides of the fence. Some states say that Amazon is the one that should be collecting it, and they're the one to make the nexus. But the ones that don't, that go the other way, they're basically saying from the very first thing you sell into our state, you've already tripped that nexus law because you have inventory in our state.
Right. And again, I don't think that's true. And the other thing to remember is that, there's still an underlying question with Amazon selling and eBay too, and probably Etsy. But I mean, I know Amazon very well. And I just had a hearing in Washington State about this. And basically, who's the retailer, Mike? I mean, who owns the customer? Who has the right to control the return policy? Who has the right to piss off the customer? Part of my language. But I mean, I always kind of say, like, it's almost like a sense of like, I think, therefore I am, or I'm a free will, the free will concept. If, what makes me a retailer and therefore responsible for collecting the tax is that I have the right to be mean and terrible to my customer. I may not be in business for very long. Right. It may not be a sound business decision, but that's sort of my right as a true retailer to do that. And, with Amazon, we know that that's impossible, that we don't even have a customer. And I put this really cool slide deck together for, these two hearings I had for specific taxpayers that were assessed in Washington State. And, we had all these pictures of, here's Amazon, here's somebody buying from the marketplace and having it delivered to the Whole Foods in Darien, Connecticut, and still no sales tax being charged, even though I'm walking into an Amazon branded store, Whole Foods, and picking it up from an Amazon branded locker. It's like, that seems ridiculous to me that you wouldn't be collecting sales tax in any of these transactions. And so, that's still a big question, and it's really a little bit problematic that the states haven't seen that. And I will say, from my hearing in Washington, the two hearing officers I spoke to were both completely surprised. They had no idea what it was like to sell. So I was the first person to come to them and say, my clients aren't retailers.
I mean, it's not atypical for a government official to not fully understand what it's like for the laws that they're creating, or, they're not in the trenches day in and day out and don't fully understand it. They just look at the numbers and don't fully understand the process. So I mean, there's two things at play here then. There's the economic nexus portion that's kind of newly been created out of all of this. And there's also the physical nexus presence test, which could potentially be argued by a state that you have by FBA, by having inventory in an FBA warehouse. But there's two sides of the coin, because we also have people that listen to this podcast that don't even sell on Amazon. So my point is that this affects everybody. Let's just use the economic nexus test. It's crazy. I mean, you're looking at, you take 200 orders into South Dakota, and what ends up happening is you think, I probably don't ship anything into South Dakota. It's such a small state. But the reality is it's 1% of the population. So if you're doing something like 300 orders a month or 400 orders a month, it's somewhere in that range, you're probably shipping 16 orders, I guess what it would actually have to be 1,600 orders a month. You're shipping the 16 orders a month into South Dakota, just by law of averages. And that's not a lot of orders. I mean, that's, you don't have to be a massive e-commerce company to kind of hit 1,600 orders a month, or in dollar volume, $1 million a year, especially. I mean, it's a thin margin business. It's not, you're not making $1 million, right? So, so what it ends up triggering is the cost of compliance for a company that's not the size of Wayfair, that's the size of me or Bernie, and that's one of the things that Bernie and I are going to talk about on this call. But it's so easy to surpass these limits, no matter who you are in e-commerce. You can, whether or not you're someone that just sells online only, someone that's a drop shipper, someone that sells on Amazon FBA, or someone who's a hybrid. I mean, everyone's affected here. And even if you're even still a smaller seller than that, where you're not tripping the economic nexus in South Dakota, it is true that that's still one of the smallest states. So you're probably still tripping economic nexus, or in at least 10 states or whatever it might be. And the compliance costs of dealing with this stuff is not as simple as tax jar somebody might make it out to be, because there's quite a bit to it. And maybe, Bernie, that's something that you can speak to, because I know you've been going through some planning here. And I mean, you and I have talked offline, but we both figured that this is a 6-figure cost to us that will, reduce our net profit next year by a significant amount if we have to comply with this.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why the work of OMG is so important here is, first of all, challenging some of these things that we've talked about where there's uncertainty, but actually it's getting word out about what the actual cost of compliance is. One of the good things about having Paul here, on the team is Paul's worked at tax departments at companies that actually do deal with all these states, and every one of those companies has what they call a SALT department, a state and local tax department, and it's a department, it's a group of people. So you get some entities, and I'm not going to not TaxJar. They're a good company. There's good people there who understand what they're doing, and I'd recommend them to somebody who is looking for some automation. But that only covers, unfortunately, a portion of the problem. It basically covers your regular filings, and often not your remittance on those. But what it doesn't cover is all the analysis of business-specific issues that you're doing, and kind of changing around your entity type sometimes to be the right entity type. For example, a lot of Amazon sellers are single-member LLCs, and if you just go kind of blindly registering in California as a single-member LLC, that'll pull your whole individual tax return into the state, so that you might have done it for your Amazon business, but if you have other things going on in terms of personal income, that gets drug into the state. TaxJar will have no idea how to advise you or steer you or adjust your entity structure to deal with issues. And there's issues at every single state. And then there's audits. And then there's all the exceptional things that happen. If you're even a day late on a payment, states will start sending letters and have penalties, which are often, kind of, it's not a normal business relationship where, people just say, oh, you paid me a day late. Okay, I'll catch up. The states are, they're all a bunch of mini IRSs that operate in that fashion, where they're not very communicative, but when they are, they're making demands on you and your time and your business and your judgment. So, when I've looked at that, this for my business, basically I'm having to almost double my bookkeeping staff in order to now go from federal and a few states to federal and all of these states. And worse, it's now so complicated, and I've got a bigger team, and I've got all these hard decisions to make. I'm getting drug away from the business to make all these decisions. It's crazy. I should be focused on my products and my customers. Instead, I'm spending a bunch of time kind of analyzing tax issues. So I got to hire a CFO. And guess what? A CFO, at least in the area I'm in, that alone is a 6-figure investment. And then there's all the, there's the automation firms like TaxJar or Avalara, which are talking. TaxJar is probably only in the thousands of dollars a year. Avalara is in the tens of thousands. And then, there's the professional help to deal with all of the exceptions, all the audits, all the weird stuff that invariably happens when you're interacting with governments that, have kind of unbending demands for you. So there's this really weird moment. Paul and I were, looking through the transcript of the Supreme Court with the Wayfair case, and the justices, they have no idea about this. I mean, even in the highest court of the land, this information out there about what's the reality of multi-state tax compliance in terms of what businesses have to do to comply. The word is not on the street about this, and legislators don't know, and the courts don't know. And so that's why, what OMG is doing here in terms of, taking this from the court angle and getting information on the public record about this, it's really important, because once people understand this a bit better, they'll actually understand what a mess we're headed towards here with the way things are trending after Wayfair.
Yeah. And I was just going to say just real quick, Paul, and you can add on to what I'm going to say here, but I think that it gets even worse from here, Bernie, because there are states, and I don't fully understand this myself because I haven't been educated in every other state, but there's a significant number of states, when I understand it, over and above the sales tax, also claim that you have an income tax obligation or business tax obligation. And I think that, and we're in California, so I already filed this $800 BOE fee, but I believe that you're also like obligated to pay that as well, and some percentage of revenue and taxes. Washington State's a good example of that as well. All of these rules, which are very fluid, and I do everything I possibly can. I can look anybody in the eye and say, like, I do everything I possibly can to pay all my taxes. Like, I've always been that way. Like, I don't even have a problem as much as some people do about paying taxes. And I try to do everything by the book as much as I possibly can, because I just don't want the headache of having an organization come after me, and I still can't get it right, and that's just trying to figure it out only in California, because like these rules, it isn't like they send you a pamphlet or tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, you're doing something wrong. Like, we're here to help you. It's the opposite. They wait 2 years or 3 years, and then they come knock on your door and tell you that you didn't check this box in this form, and now you have a $10,000 penalty for, doing something as simple as that, innocuous as that. You multiply that by 45, and it's just like, holy crap. I mean, so it's over and above what you were talking about, Bernie, but those things, and Paul, you're about to say something. Maybe you can kind of hit on some of those issues real quick, and then make your other point.
Yeah. So no, I mean, it's actually very much kind of what you said. I mean, what you guys are basically describing the last, 5-10 minutes that we just heard from both of you is called an undue burden on interstate commerce. And and those facts, like how much does it cost to comply, and what's it like to be a small business, and what do you now have to do just to start as a small business in this country? These are important points that the court made very clear were not on the record in Wayfair, and are going to be crucial to the case that we bring to the court when we go after the states and say, listen, this needs to stop. And we tell the court, basically tell the states this needs to stop, because this violates our constitutional rights under the Commerce Clause, which is basically, exists so that states can't, just make it impossible to engage in interstate commerce in this country, because that's a bad thing. We want to encourage that, right? That goes to the root of our Constitution. And so that's our lawsuit in many ways. I mean, there's many other components to it, but there is this undue burden here. And I think your point about the income tax is the one that I do. I don't single out any one tax service provider. I just say in general, the tax service providers that people tend to know in our space do not mention income tax. And that's so important, because that cost, like, even if tax jar is in the thousands, it depends on what you're doing and what you're needing. I've heard, $40 return, but none of those firms are helping you with income tax. And income tax is, if you can get an income tax return filed for your LLC for under $1,000, I'm not sure I would, but possibly. Right. And then if you can get another one filed for you personally, I'm not sure I would. But then you got to do this in like every state. So now all of a sudden your local CPA needs to know the difference between how to apportion franchise tax versus income tax in Mississippi. You do pay both. One's a net worth tax, one's an income-based tax. And there's differences and nuances to that. Yeah. And, is your local CPA in California supposed to know that, or are you going to now have to go to Ernst & Young?
And that's a burden. That. Period.
Right, exactly. So what are you supposed to do? So that goes to the burden. And I don't know if you know this, but I actually just had somebody reach out to me the other day, not an Amazon seller, just somebody who had no idea that the California LLC fee is actually an $800 minimum fee. And then there's the gross receipts tax on LLCs, which is up to, I think it's $12,000. It's based on your gross revenue. Yep. And then it's a portion to the state. So if you're, if your, California sales relative to other states, basically, if you were to take a fraction of your California sales over all sales and multiply it by your gross receipts, if it's $5 million or more, you're paying $12,000. If it's less than $5 million, you're paying $6,000. It's the scaling thing. So yeah, I mean, having an LLC and registering in California has a ton of problems, and most people who register now, who just kind of register the entity that they've been doing business with the last 5 years, are getting hit with the back tax problem too. Yep. The state wants to go back 8 years.
And we had that problem, quite frankly. I mean, this is before we moved to California, before we were doing anything in e-commerce. They're incredibly aggressive. And the way we found out about it was they took money out of our bank account. Like we didn't even know what this was going on, because they were mailing stuff to an address that didn't even exist anymore. And we finally got in touch with them, and they agreed that we didn't owe them the money, that it was a mistake. But their position was, we've already taken the money, and according to California law, if you don't appeal it by a certain point in that process, then they're not giving you the money back. So that's the kind of stuff you deal with these states. Right. I mean, it's just crazy. But I digress. Yeah, Let's get me back. I'll get myself back on track. this is a great segue because you mentioned this lawsuit, Paul, but we hadn't really kind of set up the stage of like what we're trying to do here. So let's talk about that and why, Online Merchants Guild is so important for everyone listening to like help contribute to this thing. The first thing I do want to say, like right out, first off out of the gates, this is a true nonprofit. Like the only reason I agreed to even be a part of it, I know I'm not looking to make anything out of it. Bernie's not. Paul's not even getting paid for crying out loud. At least at this stage, he's doing it kind of pro bono to start with here because we don't have the funds to do it otherwise. Completely transparent set of books and records will be published every year. No salaries of any kind or benefits of any kind to us. I mean, we're my thought for this is we have a platform, we have a voice, and I feel like an ability to spread this message and help the overall community. And I guess my own personal view on it and greed, looking at it for my own personal benefit, this is still going to be a cheaper endeavor than if a state or a group of states came after us. Because I put 5 figures into this thing to help contribute to get this thing off the ground, and so did Bernie. But that's a drop in the bucket compared to what it would cost to even if you're right, you're wrong, because just to hire counsel and fight a state. The starting point for that is much higher. So our goal here is to raise mid 6 figures over the next few months, and we're in the process right now. And by we, I mean Paul has been the one spearheading this. I'll give you a chance to talk about it here in a second, Paul. But is to file a lawsuit on behalf of Online Merchants Guild and all of the people that are a part of it, basically all e-commerce sellers, to say that this is truly an undue burden. I mean, it's at a point where. To me, it's incredibly depressing. Like I don't talk about this stuff on the podcast a whole lot because I'm a pretty positive person and I don't really get bummed much. But like, I realize that like what we're up against as a small business, if something doesn't change is basically impossible. And all the effort I put into this business over the last many years is going to be for naught if we have to comply with 45 states rules and regulations, sales tax, franchise tax, income tax, etc. I mean, it is ridiculous because we truly, especially just as mostly an Amazon seller, and that's another whole side story, like shouldn't even be caught up in the crossfire of this at all. So, Paul, in your words, as talking more in legalese and what we're trying to accomplish here, what you're trying to do over the next like 4 to 6 weeks, 8 weeks. What you hope is the best case outcome and what it's going to cost and why we need people's support to be able to do this.
Sure. So you're right. I mean, our organization, exists to take action. I mean, that's what people have to understand first and foremost. And that's pretty much where, every dollar we're raising right now. I mean, our operating expense, like you said, this is an important case to me as a state tax professional, as a law professor who teaches constitutional law and state taxation. This is a really important case, and I want to be a part of it. That's all I care about. We don't need to be paid for this. This is monumental. This is a huge issue. And so we need to take action now. I mean, that's it. And state tax cases, you mentioned, Bernie mentioned before my background, right? I was state tax litigation for, Microsoft, Walmart, GE, right? State tax cases are winnable. I mean, obviously can't guarantee we're going to win, but state tax cases are very winnable. States make really stupid cases, and they do very stupid things, and it's just up to the taxpayer to call them out on it. And that's no issue when the taxpayer is a multi-billion-dollar company. And that's typically where most state and local tax cases lie, is in that space. But, here we have this issue. The big companies really don't care because they're not selling on Amazon. And if they are, they're probably collecting a sales tax anyway. So it really kind of bypassed where the lobbies of, pro-taxpayer lobbies of the big corporations in the state and tax world really just kind of, ducked on this one because they didn't really need to address it. And that came hitting us head on. And we have no lobby looking out for us, no advocacy looking out for us. And so that's where this comes in. And so how are we going to look out for you? We're going to file a lawsuit. We are going to seek a declaratory judgment. Basically, what we're trying to do is we're going to tell the states they just need to stop. Sort of like an injunction, I guess you might have, people who know that word. And we're going to file it, hopefully in federal court. There's some challenges there, but I think we can get around it. I'd like to sue all the states. I think we're going to sue a lot of states at once and a joinder complaint. And I think the plan is, we're just going to basically bring that constitutional argument that the Supreme Court and Wayfair said we could bring, right? Taking a step back to Wayfair, right? The court was very clear at the end of the decision this was a substantial nexus case. Well, to determine the validity, the constitutionality of a state tax, there's another court case most people don't know, which is complete auto transit v. Brady, which is sort of, the whole world of state tax rests on complete auto transit v. Brady, which is a 4-part test: substantial nexus, fairly apportioned, non-discriminatory, and rationally related. And Wayfair just deals with the first part of that test. So we still have a lot of things we get to argue and bring and need to bring forward. And I'm I guess I can't guarantee results, but I'm optimistic. We wouldn't be doing this if we weren't optimistic that we have a really good fight here that needs to be brought. And so, but we need people to do it. And the cost, lawyers aren't cheap. I mean, I have my own reasons for wanting to do this. I just think it's an important case, but to hire a team of litigators and lawyers and spend all that time to prep, to research, to write briefs, to sue a lot of states at once. I mean, that's not cheap. And so, we could be talking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably 2 to 3, in this case, because of the federal court aspect. Normally a case like this, and like the cases I would bring when I was in Microsoft in California, that's $1 million lawsuit easily. So, we are getting a deal in a sense that I think, our federal court strategy could pan out, or we might have a way to shortcut things just through the way that our case is different than other typical state tax cases. But it's still a lot of money, and we need to raise that money, and we're not going to be able to do it unless people join, unless people, really look at their own situation, say, do I want to spend $100,000 of my own dollars to defend myself against one state like California, or do I contribute at the appropriate level to Online Merchants Guild and join and have and collectively have the best legal defense I probably couldn't afford on my own?
Yeah, well said. So, I mean, I want to use the last couple of minutes because we're running short on time. We try to keep these to 30 minutes, but I want to spend the last couple of minutes walking through, at least at a high level, we're gonna sue some states. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? Like, I mean, I remember first talking to you about this. I'm like, come on, man! Like, we're gonna sue a state and actually get them to change this. And you definitely convinced me, like, over time talking to you about it. So again, at just a super high level, like, what is the lawsuit? Like, we're obviously we're picking at least 30 states, but we're gonna try to get to 45 just to get all of them named. Like, this is Online Merchants Guild versus the state of California and Nevada, Utah, whatever, blah, 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 blah.
Sort of.
What is the synopsis of the brief? Like, what is it that we're suing for there? Sure.
So we're actually going to sue, when you sue a state in the tax case, you actually sue the commissioner or director, or whatever they call it in the state. So, think of a Supreme Court case about tax lawsuits in federal court called Direct Marketing Association v. Broll, which actually is the reason we have the Wayfair case. It's actually an interesting case to read because it's Judge Justice Kennedy's concurrence that led to Wayfair. And so Broll being the last name of the director of the Colorado Department of Revenue. So we're going to be suing the commissioners in their official capacity as, the head of these organizations. And basically, we're going to sue them for declaratory judgment relief, which basically means that they have to stop what they're doing. And we're going to say the reason why they have to stop what they're doing is because of the burden they're placing on you, right? That feeling of, depression and sadness we're all feeling because, like, we don't even know what to do about our business, right? That burden on interstate commerce is too much. And that there's serious alternatives that the states have to administer the tax code, such as making Amazon collect, right? I mean, Amazon, we've already had 2 states enact and actually are actively collecting on behalf of Amazon sellers, Washington and Pennsylvania. That was done without Wayfair. They didn't need Wayfair. So there's a remedy out there where the states could basically substantially reduce the burden on Amazon sellers and any eBay sellers and any other platform sellers by basically putting the burden on the marketplaces. And it seems like under our Commerce Clause cases, which really aren't tax cases, Pike versus Bruce Church being kind of the leading case that comes to mind, right, that it really isn't appropriate for the states to put this massive burden that's going to crush, small businesses, that's going to destroy the Amazon or online merchant community, not just Amazon as a whole. And when they have this sort of really obvious alternative, which is much more efficient way to administer the tax code. Oh, and it happens to be the state law as written, by the way. So we're actually also telling them this is actually what the state law says they're supposed to do,
right?
Because Amazon's actually the retailer. And so that's kind of the point of it. It's just to kind of, it's going to be, a lot of it's going to be a shame on you for the states, really. I mean, we're pointing out really their inconsistent behavior and their just hostility towards, we're an industry, we're a community of people that are, entrepreneurs with the future of this country. And this is what we want our country to be. We want people to learn how to fend for themselves and how to, become successful. And why would you want to deter that? And it seems the only people in the world that want to put a stop to that are the states for their tax administration purposes. They can get the tax other ways. So that's sort of the nature of what this is about. We're just saying, this is shame on you, states. You have a remedy. Go collect from Amazon. I don't care what politics you have with Amazon. I don't care what Amazon and you agree to in determining where the warehouse is going to go. It's irrelevant. That doesn't give you the excuse to go after, all of us as individual sellers and make it impossible for us to be small businesses, right? You can't do that.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest ironies here, you mentioned politics. I mean, the clear and political economy is to make things more equal and fair for American businesses. But this whole Wayfair case and just some of the stuff we're talking about today is even a bigger undue burden for businesses, because Chinese sellers or international sellers can give I'll throw in a swear word there. Imagine what that word is about these laws. So they're not having to worry about collecting sales tax. And if other sellers within the U.S. are having to worry about that, that's even more unfair, a bigger unfair burden as well if it doesn't get done at the platform level.
Right, exactly. If every American in the world was collecting sales tax, you would just open the door for Chinese sellers or other foreign country sellers to basically, sell products tax-free. So, I mean, you really just shift the focus to the next level, which is the international sellers. So you've accomplished nothing by doing that. So the states, it's another example of how this burden is unreasonable. It doesn't even accomplish the mission where, door number 2 is instantaneous leveling of the playing field. And
right.
Yet you seem reluctant to do that every time, which is a little concerning and shady, but I won't go there.
Yeah.
But, it's what you have to do if you want to collect the tax. You can't destroy an industry. You can't destroy an economy.
Yeah, one of the reasons I feel so strongly about this, I've contributed financially, trying to contribute time, without compensation back, is this is kind of, we're making an argument that actually, in the end, is in everybody's interest. The states, in their narrow kind of tax revenue interest and out of political expediency of not wanting to take on big players, have made this decision, to really kind of go after millions of small businesses with their tax policy. But if the United States becomes a place where starting a business requires 45 states worth of tax complexity, tax forms, tax audits, it's going to kill entrepreneurship in America. And interestingly, it's going to kill it for all the entrepreneurs in all those states. Basically, the states are going to kill each other in terms of the entrepreneurs in their states by acting in their kind of narrow parochial interest. So we're really helping these states.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're really helping them to make sure that their small business community is vibrant and that other states will not be killing off the small businesses in their states. And then interestingly, the same thing with Amazon. Amazon in these marketplaces, collecting and remitting sales tax is complicated. It is inherently complicated. The rules are constantly changing. There's a lot of work involved. And if from a tax collection point of view, that burden is placed on the marketplaces, and small businesses, in a sense, have to work through marketplaces in order to sell, in order to stay tax compliant, that's a huge competitive moat for those marketplaces. If the states basically say, well, Amazon, sales tax must be collected, and if you're selling on a platform like Amazon has to collect it. But if you kind of go on your own and sell, then maybe the burden's on you. Well, heck, that would be a world where that's hugely beneficial to Amazon, because basically now Amazon will have locked out all the small players who can't afford to put in place systems to deal with 50 states, and all the small guys have to work through the marketplaces. So and then that level playing field issue, that if you have kind of leaky laws and you have states trying to enforce things at the state level, well, guess what? Just like Mike said, this is global commerce. You're just going to have Chinese sellers. You're going to have, people from other countries. who are selling and shipping into the U.S. And without federal help, the states have no way to reach these companies, and they don't today. There's no federal help today. Yep. So you basically are saying, well, let's put all the honest American businesses out of business and hand this hand e-commerce to people, forward sellers outside the U.S. So from every perspective you look at this, we have enormous good that we can do together. But the crazy thing is, no one else is actually getting the word out here and is making these legal arguments that need to be made to kind of make the right thing happen through the court system. And that's why what OMG is doing is so important and needs more resources and more help than it currently has. Even though we have huge momentum, we actually need about 10x the momentum to really kind of take this the whole way to the end game.
Yep. Well said, my friend, and that's probably a great place to end it because we're way behind. I will mention just kind of my pitch. I'm bad at this because I'm not a fundraiser kind of guy, but go to onlinemerchantsguild.org. We have all the different misspellings, onlinemerchantguild.org and onlinemerchantsguild.com, but the official website is onlinemerchantsguild.org. Make a contribution, sign up there. We have different levels based on your revenue. I think that, again, it's a small fraction to pay versus what it would cost if you were trying to do this on your own, as Paul mentioned. And we can definitely use your support. The money will all go towards fighting this cause. There will be no company sponsor organization sponsored golf trips or first class tickets or Lambos or any of those kind of crazy things that you hear about in the news. This is one of these rare organizations where 100% of the proceeds will be used to hire lawyers and fight this cause. We have our own businesses that can support our Lambo habits for other things, but and it's all going to be, like I said, it's all public. We used I forgot the classification. I'm not a tax guy, but we got the class. Was it 501(3)(b) or C or?
So we're applying for C6 status, which we'll get, which means our records will be public. We'll have to file a public record, and check out our FAQ too on our front page. All the tax stuff, a lot more details on the FAQ on the front page of OMG. Even if you just send us an email and let us know you support us in some other way, anything you can do to help is definitely appreciated. So. OnlineMerchantsGuild.org. Bernie and Paul, thank you guys so much for your time, as always, for coming on here and doing your best to explain all this stuff in a short amount of time and taking time away from your business and your lives.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. And that's a wrap, folks. I hope you guys enjoyed the 170th episode of the EcomCrew podcast, even though it's kind of a heavy topic, something that we don't enjoy talking about or thinking about. But nonetheless, this is not something we can just go bury our head in the sand about and hope it gets better. There are 45 jurisdictions out there all figuring out how things are going to be going moving forward. They are all doing things in different ways and different regulations, and very difficult for us small businesses to comply or even know what the heck is going on until you get a knock on the door or a letter in the mail that something's not going right. So as another reminder, you can go to ecomcrew.com/170 to get to the show notes for this episode. But what I really hope you guys go do is go to www.onlinemerchantsguild.org and pledge your support for our organization. And hopefully together we can make some real progress with this issue. And until the next episode, everybody, happy selling, and we'll talk to you then.
Thanks for listening to the EcomCrew podcast. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/EcomCrew for weekly live recordings of the EcomCrew podcast every Monday. And please do us a favor and leave an honest review on iTunes. It would really help us out. Again, thanks for listening. And until next week, happy selling.